Welcome to episode 404 of Hot Media with Bob Mann. Every week on this podcast, we talk about the hottest media issues, the hottest controversies, and the hottest content in mass media. And it's been a while since we've had one of our regular guests on the program, Dr. Paul Levinson, professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University in New York City. You can talk with Paul about just about everything we cover here, whether we're talking about the news or whether we're talking about entertainment and good television or what he's writing and composing. But Paul, first of all, nice to have you back for season number 4 now that the summer is done. And great to have you back here on the program.
Well, happy to be here as always, Bob.
Let's talk about the primary subject that I wanted to talk about, which is the coverage of Ukraine, both here in the United States with a free media and in Russia with a state run media, which would always have to be suspect. So let's talk about our own media first. By the way, thanks to you, I had that lead on that journalist turned Ukrainian freedom fighter, Yuri Matsarsky, and a lot of brave people winning against this very, very powerful nation. But are we here in the United States, our media kind of forgetting about it because we have so much to look at in terms of the economy, inflation, politics, the upcoming midterm elections? Are we backburnering something which could really be one of the biggest things in modern history?
Well, first of all, it is certainly one of the biggest things in recent and current history. In fact, I think you could say it's the biggest thing because if you have someone like Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons, which he's done in the past couple of days, you can't get much bigger than that. And I think that actually is the answer to your question. Even if there are so many other important things going on that our media are not giving as much attention to Ukraine as they were, say, last February and March when the Russians first invaded the country. And that has happened. But pretty much every time it happens, Putin does something else that draws our attention into that tragic situation there. Or that's bad news that Putin does that. The good news is that the Ukrainians recently have made some extraordinary strides in reclaiming their territory. But the war is obviously a long way from over. And even if it's not in the headlines, even if it's not talked about in the media, it's always right on the doorstep of being talked about because it is so crucial.
Let's have just a little bit of communication theory for the audience here, although I think anybody listening to or watching this program already knows. But you can't, and people, I guess, do assume that every nation on earth has free press and free media the way that we do here in the United States. But that is not the case, probably in the majority of countries, right? I mean, a lot of people are dealing with state run media, and the Russians are too. So explain that difference between a free communication, free press media, and a state run situation.
Well, the difference is here in the United States, when someone on Fox News says good things about Trump and lies about Joe Biden, that person on Fox News is saying what she or he truly believes. And that's an unfortunate thing for other reasons, but at least it does demonstrate our freedom of the press. Not a perfect freedom, but nonetheless a freedom. You were going to say
And there are other networks which will give you a different narrative too. You're not just hearing the one. I think that's the biggest danger in these state-run media situations, the single narrative.
that's right. But this goes back actually even to the Soviet Union. It's a very interesting way of controlling what the people in the country that are listening or watching this media, what message they get. And it's a very clever way of manipulating them. And ever since this war began, you've had, in effect, shills on Russian television arguing the NATO point, being even pro Ukraine, contrary to Russia, saying maybe it's a wrong thing for Russia to do this. Maybe NATO is not something that we in Russia should be opposing. And they provide good arguments. They actually provide the truth. And the reason,
But that's confusing me tremendously. How can they, if he is a dictator and that state-run media, how can they criticize him without going to the gulag? Is this a setup? What is this?
well, it's exactly a setup because you also always have in those same sets, in those same newsrooms, or if they're connected through Zoom, you inevitably have people who are pro Putin who actually want to intensify the war. And, what their take on what the critics of the war always is. That's right. You're right. The war is not going well, but the last thing we want to do is lose the war, weaken Russia, pull out of Ukraine. What you just said is exactly the reason why we have to intensify our military efforts there, pour more troops in, pour more weapons in, use nuclear weapons, nuke Berlin, nuke all the places that are helping Ukraine.
This sounds very familiar to American debates of the 1960s and early 70s. You had people who were screaming for peace, saying that it was not a war in America's interest and it was unfair intervention. And then you had Curtis LeMay and other people saying, no, the problem is we didn't go far enough. But again, that was a situation in the United States where you could have different outlets and you go, all right, I don't like what that guy says. I'll listen to what this person says. But in Russia, they're getting the one narrative. So they could stitch this all together in a way that they can lay it out without opposition.
Yeah, and look, I actually have been a witting, not an unwitting, a witting player in this. I've been on the O'Reilly Factor. I was on the O'Reilly Factor. Of course, it's no longer on Fox, but 3 or 4 times, some years ago. And obviously, my opinions back then differed radically with O'Reilly's on just about every opinion. And people used to ask me, why do you think O'Reilly is having you on if he knows you're going to disagree with him? And I was glad to go on because I like getting my opinions out there. And being a believer in human rationality, I think when people are presented with the truth, they can recognize it. But O'Reilly and Fox were happy to have me on there because I would say something, and that would give O'Reilly an opportunity to roll out his big guns as to why what I was saying wasn't right. And this, in contrast, what I was saying is the way we should go, etc. And so this was actually a time-honored approach, and it is fascinating to think about it. Look, it's a dangerous approach from the point of view now of Putin and the people who want to intensify the war, because you can never guarantee what anyone who is watching that will think. Maybe they'll think the shills actually are right, and it'll drum up more opposition to Putin. The fact that we are now seeing that is just another indication of Putin's desperation. He's doing anything that he can to stir up opinion, and he expects it to coalesce behind his position.
But even if you have a state run media, which is feeding the public what the dictator wants to know, when the reality seeps into the local cities and villages, for example, a draft, people leaving the country, can that still turn opinion? I think it did in Poland back in the 1980s and some of the Soviet satellites when Lech Wałęsa went and, they were handing out VHS videotapes and groups of families would buy VCRs. Can the truth seep in even when you have just a propaganda machine?
Yes, and we've probably even talked about this uh, in some of our interviews over the years because it comes up over and over again. Even in the worst days of Nazi Germany, the White Rose, which were basically it was a college professor and a group of university students in Nazi Germany were able to use primitive photocopying devices to get out the truth of what the Nazis were doing. Now, eventually, the SS was able to crush, those people and anyone else who was trying to stand up to Hitler. But the truth did get out there. And in the 1980s, in the Soviet Union, there was something called samizdat video. And what that was, obviously everyone knows what video is, but samizdat meant underground rebellious video. And what those videos did was criticize the Soviet Union. And they actually wound up not being murdered because, fortunately for them, Gorbachev was ascending into power, and he had a much more what we would call uh, democratic view of what he wanted his society to be.
And since he just died recently, he got to see, unfortunately, Putin's rise to power and control in an alleged democracy. It's tough. Before we switch to other subjects, what should America be doing? American media, independent, commercial media, to front burner Ukraine, and despite the fact that there's so much else, gas prices, all the rest to talk about, how do we put this life and death daily situation, on the front burner without just turning it into horse race coverage of who's winning the battle today?
Well, if I was able to control what American media are doing, I would seriously put aside, if we're talking about a broadcast news operation or a cable news operation, at least 10 minutes in every hour of coverage devoted to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whatever else was going on. Because again, it's that important. And again, I think what's been happening is, even though a day or two or three goes by in which there isn't a report on Ukraine, it's always close at hand. And we haven't really gotten into a situation where we're hardly talking about Ukraine as much as we should. That, by the way, is a completely different topic. That, by the way, is in contrast to COVID coverage, where I think it has really left the front pages and being reported on in the news. And to the extent that Biden, as you know, just a few days ago said, well, the pandemic is over. We're still fighting COVID, but the pandemic is over. And although I tend to support Joe Biden, I have to say I think that was a very foolish and incorrect thing for the president of the United States to say. 500 people a day are still dying of this horrible virus, whether it's breakthrough cases or they weren't vaccinated. I'm not drilling down on that level, but tell that the pandemic is over to relatives of those 500 people who are dying daily. So this is what the problem is with media in general, whether it's a newspaper, even though they can expand their number of pages, they don't want to have an Encyclopedia Britannica dropped on your doorstep. So they limit the number of stories they cover. And then, of course, as we know, and this started with broadcast television, and it's continued for the most part in cable, if you have an hour to do the news, you can't talk about everything. And so they have to make decisions, and sometimes they make the wrong decision.
It's interesting because I too am a supporter, but as I watch 60 Minutes, which I do every week, and this was the premiere episode of season 55. So I was definitely watching on the day, the actual air date, instead of on the Paramount Plus app. I cringed. I just cringed. And it's a shame because that just gives people something to latch on to, to beat at him. So it's tough. Let's move on from the very serious. Not that your pursuits are not serious, but it's a little more fun to talk about. Finishing a novel and a radio play and all of the rest. I'd like to hear about it.
Well, I'm really excited about this, and I think we probably talked about this also a little bit before in the past, but now some really exciting new things are happening with it. Uh, every time I've heard the Beatles sing "Real Love," it's real love. It just, this was the song, one of the songs that John Lennon had written after the Beatles had broken up, and Yoko Ono gave Paul McCartney a tape of some very rough demos of a few of the songs that John Lennon had written, and one of those songs is it's called Real Love. And Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr in the 90s got together with Jeff Lynne. They produced a record with John Lennon's original voice, but with the other Beatles putting in their own voices and the music. And that was really the last record that was released by the Beatles. Real Love on one side, Free as a Bird on the other side. And every time I heard that record, it broke my heart because Lennon should have been alive. That should have been a Beatle record with four Beatles singing alive, not one of the Beatles tragically murdered here in New York, and the three other Beatles singing that song all those years later. So the way I write, I have these experiences in life, and then it could be a week later, it could be 10 years later, whatever. I just get like an urge to write something about it, and so I got the urge to write this alternate history featuring the late, wonderful, and much beloved WFUV disc jockey Pete Fornatel, and it's 1996, and he is playing a record called Real Life, and it's by the Beatles, and the Beatles are alive and together then. The reason why it's called Real Life is that was the original title of the song when John Lennon started writing it. And so he plays this song, and he, like me, because my characters are always based on me, he feels like a tug in his heart and his soul, because he knows that there's something that's not right about this record. So anyway, I don't want to tell the whole story, but to make a long story short, he takes a walk through Fordham's tunnels, takes a train down to Grand Central Station, and by the time he gets to Manhattan, he discovers he's in an alternate reality, which in fact is our alternate reality, in which John Lennon was killed in 1980. And then he has to figure out a way to get back first to his original reality, but also a way, maybe, is there anything he could do to prevent John Lennon's assassination? So this was a short story that I published early in 2022. It got a lot of great response. So a whole bunch of things are happening with it, including a former student of mine from the New School for Social Research when I first started teaching in their master's program in 1983. He now has a sort of Twilight Zone radio program, and he is doing a radio play of this short story, including, by the way, some live performances. And it should be, really exciting. In addition to that, I've expanded this into a novel, and there's somebody now thinking about, well, would it best be made into a movie or a limited TV series? I'm pushing for the limited TV series. So there are all kinds of things that are happening, and everyone should stay tuned, and we'll see how this goes.
So you say it's a Twilight Zone type radio show. Is this a podcast, or is it a broadcast? What exactly is the form?
Well, it is. It's not a broadcast radio station.
Nothing wrong with that.
No, it's an internet radio station. So I guess technically you would call it a podcast. But the one slight difference is, although people will be able to listen to it whenever they want once it's done, I'm pretty sure there's going to be, when it's first put up, a live performance of it. In other words, it's going to be recorded, but I might be on hand to talk about it after it's first aired. And so in that sense, it'll almost be like a live, old-fashioned radio performance. As you know, of course, the idea of, radio doing science fiction, mystery kind of things, that in fact is what radio did in the 1930s, the 1940s, the
Theater,
shadow.
theater of the mind.
Yes, that's
I mean,
right.
look what Orson Welles was able to do. He scared half the country out of their wits. Do you know,
Exactly.
I've played that in class at Caldwell University, and yeah, I can't blame the students, 18 to 22-year-olds, for not being scared, because by today's standards, it's not scary anymore. But
No.
now, these podcasts have taken old time radio and brought it back. So when's there going to be a next update on this? Because I'd love to devote an episode to this and talk about this.
Well, okay, so here we are. It's now the end of September. I would guess that the radio play part of this will be up by the end of October, maybe a little later. So talking about end of October, beginning of November.
Well, you being one of my regular suspects, as I like to call them, you're like a pitcher. You're on like a 6-week rotation here. It's just a little longer than a Major League Baseball pitcher. So I think we can time this out perfectly. This is great. This sounds exciting, Paul. But then again, I never have you on when you're not doing something exciting. So
Well,
it's always something new.
Well, as you know, I'm a firm believer of doing as much damage as possible. And one of the things I learned a long time ago, and anyone who's listening to this who is into writing or making music or whatever, this is the thing. It's a very important point. What happens with most people, including even me to some extent, you have a creative idea, but either you're too busy to do it then, or you have another part of your mind which is saying, well, you sure this is good? Do you really want to do this? Blah, 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 blah. And there are all these things that tend to get in the way of anyone fulfilling their creative ideas and potential. And I've learned, over these many years that you have to put aside those obstacles and do it. And, okay, it may not turn out that good. Not every song by the Beatles is a great song. Most of them are. But if you don't do it, you'll never know whether it was really worthwhile or not. And certainly the world won't know.
Well, that's a good piece of advice, because there's always a reason. Well, I'll do it as soon as I'm done with this. Well, as soon as you're done with X, Y comes along. So, you got to make the time for it. But listen, it's always wonderful to have you here in the program. And we will come back getting ready for this live radio program or this live action play. And it's just great. But thank you also for some really good insights on what's going on with Ukraine and Russia and the media in a free country and the media in a country that's not. And, it's always great to have you here on the program.
My pleasure as always, Bob.
Paul, if you could just stay with me until I sign off, just so I can talk to you. I say off the air. It's off the air because I can't think of a better expression. But thank you so much for the audience. That is Dr. Paul Levinson, who is professor of communication and media studies at my alma mater, Fordham University in New York City. Thank you. And so right now, I just want to remind you that this is primarily an audio podcast, Hot Media with Bob Mann. Every week on this program, what we do is discuss the hottest content and the hottest issues in the media. And sometimes that is entertainment. Sometimes it is serious news. Sometimes it's sports. We had Gabe Honing on a couple of times talking about the captain and Derek Jeter. So if you're interested in media, there's just so much to hear about it right here in this program. We ask you to find out out more about the podcast, which also has raw interviews up on YouTube, www.bobmanhotmedia.com. For those of you watching, there's the lower third. It is Bob Mann with 2 N's. Please follow me on Twitter. My handle is @BobMannMedia, and on Instagram, it is BobMan92. And I thank you for watching on a regular basis, listening on a regular basis to this program, Hot Media. And we urge you always not only to watch and to listen, but to subscribe. And we'll be talking to you soon.